Welcome back. We're ready to go again. I do have a little bit of a news announcement for you. Yesterday, what that was for me, on the 5th of May, Cinco de Mayo, the department had a meeting, and I attended that meeting on Zoom, and did get some news about what we're doing that I will be posting for you in detail. But we will be going ahead with a final exam for this class, and that will be during the week that final exams were originally scheduled. So the details have to be worked out yet, but there will be a final, and it will be at the regular time. I'm also going to go ahead and give you a chance to earn some extra credit. I've done that in the past, and I've done it in collaboration with the department. The department has developed a program for that I've been able to use for extra credit. Well, we're not going to do that this year without the facilities available to us. But I will find another way to give you extra credit. I have to devise that myself. In the past, I've given a department quiz for extra credit. I'll have to devise this year myself. But there will be a chance for you to earn extra credit, so you might stay tuned for that, and a chance to raise your grade through an extra credit. But just let you know this now, and the details when they're finalized will be made available to you through our normal Canvas proceedings. Now, this week I'm going to be lecturing on the last of Chapter 8. I still hadn't finished that last week. So there will be, on the quiz that you'll have for this week, there are some questions from Chapter 8, but that I will cover basically today in this lecture. And then we'll go on to Chapter 9. I'm not going to spend as much time on Chapter 9. I've spent a lot of time on Chapter 7, a lot of time on Chapter 8. I'm going to give Chapter 9 a much more superficial going over, and there'll be a quiz on your quiz for this week will include Chapter 9. Which I may start today and we'll get to and cover in the second lecture for this week. So that's where you are, the latter part of Chapter 8 and all of Chapter 9 on this week's quiz. Now, what I've been talking about in the last lecture was the War of 1812. And I talked about why we got into that war, and then I mentioned that, all right, we declared war against England. We went to war with a great deal of optimism, a great deal of enthusiasm. The war hawks in Congress, Republican members of Congress, who were identified as the war hawks, mostly from the West, had been very adamant about going to war. They were very patriotic and very warlike, and they thought, oh, we're going to win this war, and it's going to be a great victory for us, and we're going to show how great America is, and we're going to be crushing the British and doing all of this stuff, and it's going to be this great victory for America. And it didn't work out. The war was, in fact, very much of a humiliating and devastating experience for the United States. We did very poorly in military affairs, and we had all kinds of other problems. And I started to talk about that last week, and I mentioned that one of our big mistakes was to think that somehow the Canadians were going to join us. That the Canadians, when we invaded, would be happy to see us. They would welcome us as liberators, and they would all join with us, and that's how we're going to get this great victory, because we're going to drive the British troops out of Canada and bring Canada into the United States, which we felt it should have been all along. And it's going to be a great, wonderful victory for the United States. And we misjudged the Canadians. The Canadians were not interested in becoming part of the United States. The reason most of those people were in Canada was because they didn't want to be in the United States. These are people who either themselves or their ancestors had fled to Canada during the American Revolutionary War to get away from the United States. They were loyal to England. They wanted to remain loyal to England. They wanted to remain part of the British Empire. They did not want to join the United States. That's why they left the United States. They fled in many cases to save their lives, and they went to Canada. So when we come up to invade them and say, hey, we're here to free you, oh no, they turned against us, and we had some battles in Canada, which were mostly humiliating failures for the United States. We generally lost battle after battle, had some success. I think I mentioned that during one of those battles, we did kill Tecumseh. Tecumseh had fled to Canada when the war began to seek the protection of the British, and he had joined the British Army, and so he was fighting alongside Canadian militia forces against the United States, and in a battle he was killed. But we did not do well in those battles. They were mostly failures. We really misjudged Canada. That was one of our big mistakes. Another big problem that we had was that there was serious opposition to the war within the United States. The country was badly, badly divided. We were not united and to join together to fight against a common enemy. President Madison tried to sort of rally support from the Northeast, especially New England. That's why in his message to Congress he did not mention these are sometimes called Western issues. He did not mention that we were out to get land. He did not mention that we were out to get the Indians in order to free up access to the land that the Indians were still holding. That would make it look like we're going to war for the benefit of the West. And he's trying to say this is a war for all Americans. It's a war for people in New England because New England is affected by these issues of impressment and neutral rights and trade, but they weren't having it. They had always felt that we were wrong to be siding against England. People felt that England was our natural ally. We are, after all, part of the Anglo-speaking world, and England was our biggest trading partner. So people in the New England always felt, if we're going to go to war against anybody, we should go to war against France, not against England. England is our natural ally. It's our major trading partner. So there had always been resistance to the various measures that Jefferson and Madison had taken, the Embargo Act, the Non-Intercourse Act, Makin's Bill No. 2. Those had always been unpopular in New England and the Northeast. And the war certainly was unpopular in New England and the Northeast. And Madison at least made some efforts to try to bring the country together by downplaying the issues that would be offensive to New England and trying to stress that this is for their benefit, and they just weren't having it. So there continued to remain opposition. New England state legislatures would adopt laws to prevent the recruitment of American soldiers within their states. They would not allow recruiters for the United States Army to come into their states to recruit their people into the U.S. Army. They would not allow any of their tax revenue to be used for support of the National Army. They would not allow their militias to be used to fight against the English during the war. A number of measures that states took. Each state was a little bit different, but they all took measures to try to keep their state out of the war. And as long as I'm talking about this, I might as well go ahead and say this now. As of 1814, a number of New England states decided to do what we have done on several occasions and have a convention, have a calling where they would invite other states to come together and talk about how they could work together to oppose the war. So there was a convention starting in mid or late 1814 in Hartford, Connecticut. It's called, obviously, the Hartford Convention. And the New England states all sent delegates to that convention, and they discussed measures that they could take to work together. They were all taking measures by themselves. They said, let's get together, let's have a convention, let's try to coordinate our efforts. This is what we do. This is what we had done starting with the Stamp Act Congress, back when we were calling them Congresses, get together and work on a plan to work together as a unit instead of each state by itself. And so they decided we'll do such things as the things that I was talking about. We will all agree that our militias cannot be used to support the U.S. Army. We'll all agree that none of our tax revenues can be used for military purposes to support the U.S. Army or the whole war campaign. And some of the delegates there, some of the delegates who came to that convention, even suggested, and this was not adopted by the convention, but some of the delegates there suggested that if the Congress and if President Madison and if the whole U.S. government continues the war against England, that we should secede from the Union. We should draw out of the Union. Now these are Whigs. Excuse me, they're Federalists. This is the party of Alexander Hamilton. As I said, the Federalist Party had been going downhill ever since the election of 1800 when they lost. They'd lost every presidential election. In election after election, they kept going poorer and poorer. And then the whole opposition to the Embargo Act, the whole opposition to the war, that kind of revitalized the Federalist Party. It gave them some new strength. That was a very popular issue in the Northeast, especially in New England. And so the Federalists had sort of a rejuvenation as a result of their opposition to Jefferson and his embargo, opposition to the other trade measures that Madison took, and certainly opposition to the war. That was very popular in New England, and that was something that the Federalists sort of jumped onto and said, hey, this is an issue that we can use to try to regain some political strength. So the whole Hartford Convention was all set up and run by Federalists in those New England states. Well, let's think about this. The Federalist Party was the party of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the guy who at the convention wanted to get rid of states. He wanted to have the United States be a single nation only. And certainly in his argument about the constitutionality of the bank, certainly in all of the work that he had done as Secretary of Treasury, he was trying to promote the United States as a single nation. And one of the big issues that separated the Federalists from the Republicans was the Federalists were the party of being a single nation. The Republicans, with Jefferson and Madison and the Kentucky and Virginia resolves that I talked about last week, they are advocates of the idea that we're a federation of states. So the Federalist is the party of single nationhood. And here it's Federalists at Hartford who are advocating that the states leave the Union, that they act as states, and as a state adopt a resolution or something saying we're no longer a part of the United States. And their argument was they had ratified the Constitution as a state, they could sort of unratify it. They're going to cancel their ratification of the Constitution, they're going to cancel their membership in the United States. Now, that was not adopted, but that shows just how strong opposition to the war was among the Federalists of New England. They are willing to sort of rebuke everything that they stood for. Poor old Hamilton, he was dead by this time, but if he'd been alive, he would have been absolutely scandalized. The poor man, he was probably turning over in his grave to see his party advocating just the exact opposite of what he'd always stood for. But that should be a guide to how much people in New England hated the war, and they did not want to be part of it. They were willing, they didn't go this far yet, and we don't know what would have happened if the war had gone on, but they were just so anti-war and so unhappy with having to be involved in that war, that they were ready to renounce everything that the Federalist Party had stood for and leave the United States and become separate states out of the country. That was another thing. Another problem that we had during the war was that we had trouble financing the war. Now this brings us back to something we talked about earlier, the Bank of the United States. Remember, one of the reasons why Hamilton advocated having a bank was that it was set up so that if there was ever another emergency, that the government, the Treasury Department, would be able to borrow money from the Bank of the United States. And because of the way it's set up, because the U.S. Treasury is going to issue bonds, and because those bonds can be used as reserves for currency, they're as good as gold. So just as you use gold as the reserves to back up your currency, the Bank of the United States could lend money to Congress. They could just print the money, back it up with government bonds that the Treasury Department is going to give them in exchange for their payments. The bank is essentially buying bonds from the Treasury Department, and it's willing to do that because those bonds will back up the paper money that it's going to issue as loans to the government. So this was part of Hamilton's plan. And this is one of the reasons why I felt it was so important to get the Bank of the United States. So here we are, we're in another emergency. This is when, now, as of 1812, we have to be able to borrow money, and that's what the bank is for. And the bank was gone. The bank had been chartered in 1791. Just remember some facts here. The bank had been chartered in 1791. It was chartered for 20 years, which meant that its charters expired in 1811. So the Republicans who were running the country in 1811 made no effort to reestablish the bank. They'd always been anti-bank. That was one of the things that was the basis of the Republican Party, was opposition to the bank and Hamilton's plans. So the bank was gone. So here we are, back where we'd been in the Revolution. Congress is trying to raise money to fight the war, and they can't just get loans from the Bank of the United States. They have to go to state banks. They have to borrow money wherever they can. They have to scrounge here, scrounge there. As we had done during the Revolution, it was really hard for us during the Revolution. It was really hard for us in the War of 1812. We had a hard time fighting the war because we didn't have a bank. And it's so ironic that one of Hamilton's reasons for having the bank was, if there's ever another war, we'll have the bank to lend us money. And so here there is, another war, and wouldn't you know it, the bank has just expired and gone away. So that was another problem that we had. And then in general, we had a problem just getting the army together and fighting, and we just were not prepared for war. So altogether, the war went very badly for the United States.